In the rolling hills of Lorraine, where morning mist clings to ancient oak trees and the Meuse River winds its way through valleys that have witnessed 1,000 years of human stories, there stood a small village called Domrémy. The year was 1412 and France was bleeding. The 100 Years' War had carved deep wounds across the countryside, turning fertile fields into battlegrounds and transforming peaceful villages into fortresses of fear. It was here, in this humble corner of a war-torn world, that a child was born who would change the course of history. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc, though the world would come to know her simply as Joan. She entered the world during one of the darkest periods in French history, when the very existence of France as a unified kingdom hung in the balance like morning dew on a spider's web. The house where Joan was born was neither grand nor poor by the standards of medieval peasantry. It was a solid stone structure with thick walls that could withstand both winter's bitter cold and summer's oppressive heat. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, was a man of modest means but considerable respect within the village community. He owned several plots of fertile land and held the position of tax collector, a role that required both literacy and the trust of his neighbors. Her mother, Isabelle Romee, came from the nearby village of Vauthon and brought with her a deep, unshakable faith that would profoundly influence her daughter's spiritual development. Joan's childhood unfolded against the backdrop of a France divided against itself. The legitimate king, Charles VI, suffered from periods of madness that left the kingdom vulnerable to both internal strife and external invasion. The English, under Henry V, had achieved devastating victories at battles like Agincourt in 1415, where French knights fell like wheat before the scythe of English longbows. Meanwhile, the Duke of Burgundy had allied himself with the English, creating a civil war within the broader conflict that pitted Frenchmen against Frenchmen. Yet in Domrémy, life maintained a rhythm that had persisted for generations. Joan grew up helping her mother with household duties, learning to spin wool and tend to the family's small garden where they grew herbs and vegetables. She would later testify that she could sew and spin as well as any woman in Rouen, skills that grounded her in the practical realities of medieval life even as her destiny pulled her toward extraordinary circumstances. The village children of Domrémy lived lives bounded by seasons and saints' days, by harvest festivals and the ever-present awareness of war's proximity. Joan played the games that peasant children had played for centuries, but those who knew her recalled something different about the young girl. She was more serious than her peers, more inclined to seek solitude in the village church or in quiet corners of the surrounding forests. The church of Saint Remy stood at the heart of village life, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain but still solid, still providing sanctuary for souls seeking comfort in uncertain times. Joan attended Mass regularly with her family, and the priest, Father Guillaume Front, would later remember her as an exceptionally devout child who seemed to absorb religious instruction with unusual intensity. She learned the fundamental prayers of medieval Christianity, the Ave Maria and Pater Noster, and developed a particular devotion to the Virgin Mary that would remain constant throughout her brief but remarkable life. As Joan grew from child to adolescent, her responsibilities increased. She helped tend the family's small flock of sheep, leading them to pasture in the meadows that surrounded Domrémy. It was during these solitary hours, watching over animals whose wool would eventually be spun into the cloth that formed the backbone of the village economy, that Joan first began to experience the spiritual phenomena that would transform her from peasant girl to national savior. The voices began when Joan was 13 years old, on a summer day in 1425 when the sun hung heavy in the sky and the air shimmered with heat that made distant objects dance like spirits. She was in her father's garden, probably weeding among the vegetables or gathering herbs for her mother's cooking, when she heard what she would later describe as a voice coming from the direction of the church, accompanied by a great light. The voice, Joan would later testify, belonged to Saint Michael the Archangel, the warrior saint who had cast Satan from heaven and who served as protector of France. Michael appeared to her not as the fearsome warrior of medieval art, with flaming sword and wings spread wide, but as a figure of immense gentleness and authority. He spoke to her in French, the language of her daily life rather than the Latin of formal religious ceremony, and his message was both simple and revolutionary. She must be a good girl and go to church often. But this initial encounter was only the beginning. Over the following months and years, the voices multiplied and their messages became more specific and more urgent. Saint Margaret of Antioch, the virgin martyr who had triumphed over a dragon through faith and courage, began speaking to Joan with increasing frequency. Saint Catherine of Alexandria, another virgin martyr renowned for her wisdom and learning, joined the celestial chorus that guided Joan's spiritual development. These saints appeared to Joan not as distant figures from religious paintings but as vivid, immediate presences who spoke with her as familiarly as neighbors might converse across a garden fence. They provided comfort during times of uncertainty and guidance when she faced difficult decisions. Most importantly, they began preparing her for a mission that would require her to leave behind everything familiar and venture into a world of courts and armies, of politics and warfare that lay far beyond the experience of a peasant girl from Lorraine. The content of these supernatural conversations evolved gradually. Initially, the saints focused on Joan's spiritual development, encouraging her to maintain her devotion to God and to live according to Christian principles. They praised her virginity, which in medieval thinking represented not merely sexual purity but a state of spiritual wholeness that enabled direct communication with the divine. They encouraged her charitable impulses, her tendency to give food to beggars and to care for sick neighbors. But as Joan entered her teenage years and the military situation in France grew increasingly desperate, the messages from her celestial advisors became more specific and more demanding. The English had gained control of most of northern France, including the capital city of Paris. The dauphin Charles, the rightful heir to the French throne, remained uncrowned and controlled only the territories south of the Loire River. French morale had reached its lowest point in decades, and many believed that God had abandoned France to its enemies as punishment for the sins of its people. It was in this context of national crisis that Joan's voices began speaking to her about a mission that seemed impossible for anyone, let alone a teenage peasant girl. Saint Michael told her that she must go to the dauphin and persuade him to provide her with an army. With this army, she would lift the English siege of Orléans, the key city whose fall would open the entire Loire Valley to English conquest. After relieving Orléans, she would escort the dauphin to Reims Cathedral, where French kings had been crowned for centuries, and see him properly crowned as Charles VII. The audacity of this mission cannot be overstated. Medieval society was rigidly hierarchical, with peasants expected to remain in their assigned social position throughout their lives. The idea that a teenage girl could gain access to the royal court, let alone convince the dauphin to entrust her with military command, violated every social convention of the age. Moreover, warfare was exclusively a masculine domain, governed by codes of chivalry and military expertise that took decades to master. Yet Joan's voices insisted that this impossible mission was God's will, and they provided her with specific instructions about how to accomplish it. They told her that she must first travel to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs, where she should seek out the captain of the garrison, Robert de Baudricourt. Baudricourt, they assured her, would initially refuse her request but would eventually provide her with an escort to the dauphin's court at Chinon. As Joan absorbed these extraordinary revelations, she maintained the outward appearance of a normal peasant teenager. She continued helping with household chores, attending church services, and caring for the family's livestock. But inwardly, she was undergoing a transformation that would soon make it impossible for her to remain in Domrémy. The voices spoke to her with increasing urgency, reminding her that France's need was desperate and that delay could result in the permanent loss of the kingdom to English rule. The psychological burden of carrying such momentous secrets while continuing to live an ordinary village life created tremendous internal pressure for Joan. She later testified that the voices came to her 2 or 3 times per week, always accompanied by light and often occurring when she heard the village church bells ringing. These supernatural encounters filled her with both joy and terrible responsibility, as she gradually came to understand that her peaceful childhood was ending and that she was being called to a destiny that would require enormous courage and sacrifice. The final years of Joan's time in Domrémy were marked by increasing tension between her divine mission and her earthly circumstances. Her parents, Jacques and Isabelle, began noticing changes in their daughter's behavior. She became more withdrawn, spending long hours in prayer and often seeming distracted during family conversations. Jacques reportedly had disturbing dreams about Joan leaving home with soldiers, visions that filled him with such dread that he told his sons, He would rather drown Joan with his own hands than see her dishonored by association with men of war. These parental concerns reflected the harsh realities of medieval warfare, where women who traveled with armies often faced terrible fates. Rape was a common occurrence during military campaigns, and even women under official protection could find themselves vulnerable to violence from undisciplined soldiers. For a peasant father like Jacques, the thought of his teenage daughter venturing into such an environment represented his worst nightmare. But Joan's mission was not something she could discuss with her parents or anyone else in Domrémy. The voices had made it clear that her calling must remain secret until the proper time for action arrived. This requirement for secrecy added another layer of isolation to Joan's already transformed inner life, as she watched her friends and family continue their normal routines while knowing that her own path would soon diverge dramatically from everything they had ever known. The lambs listened, but she listened to the wind. As 1428 drew to a close, Joan's voices became more insistent about the urgency of her mission. The English were preparing a major offensive that would likely target Orléans in the coming year. If that city fell, the entire southern region of France would lie open to conquest, and the Dauphin's cause would become hopeless. Time was running out for France, and time was running out for Joan's opportunity to fulfill her divine calling. The girl who had spent her childhood watching sheep in the meadows of Lorraine was about to embark on a journey that would transform her into one of history's most remarkable figures. But first, she would have to convince a skeptical military commander that God had chosen a peasant teenager to save France from its enemies. The greatest adventure in medieval history was about to begin. Part 2. The Road to Recognition, 1428 to 1429. The winter of 1428 brought more than cold winds to the village of Domrémy. News arrived with traveling merchants and soldiers that the English had begun their long-anticipated assault on Orléans, the key to controlling the Loire Valley and the last major obstacle to their complete conquest of France. For Joan, now 16 years old, these reports carried a weight that no one around her could understand. Her voices had been preparing her for this moment, and now the urgency of their message became undeniable. Saint Michael appeared to her with increasing frequency during those dark winter months, his celestial light cutting through the gloom of shortened days and lengthening shadows. The archangel's messages were no longer gentle encouragements toward piety but urgent commands for action. France could not wait another season, another month, perhaps not even another week. The time had come for Joan to leave behind everything she had ever known and step into a destiny that would either save her country or destroy her utterly. The first challenge lay close to home, in the form of her uncle Durand Laxart, who lived in the village of Bury-le-Petit, a few miles from Domrémy. Joan's voices had instructed her to seek his help in reaching Vaucouleurs, but this required a deception that troubled her deeply devout conscience. She could not tell her family the true reason for her journey, as they would never have allowed her to pursue what they would see as dangerous delusions. Instead, she told her parents that her aunt, Durand's wife, was about to give birth and needed Joan's assistance. The lie came easily enough, as such requests for help during childbirth were common in medieval villages, where women supported each other through the dangerous process of bringing new life into the world. Joan's parents granted permission for the visit without suspicion, and in early January 1429, she made the short journey to Bury-le-Petit, carrying with her nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of divine purpose. Durand Laxart was a simple man, a farmer like his brother-in-law Jacques, but he possessed a quality that Joan desperately needed. He was willing to listen. When his young niece arrived at his home and began speaking of voices and divine missions, he did not immediately dismiss her words as the fantasies of an overwrought girl. Perhaps he saw something in her eyes, a certainty and intensity that transcended her humble origins. Perhaps he simply remembered the old stories of saints and miracles that formed the backbone of medieval faith. Whatever the reason, Durand found himself drawn into Joan's extraordinary vision. Joan told her uncle that God had commanded her to go to the Dauphin and restore him to his rightful throne. She spoke of the voices that had guided her since childhood, of Saint Michael and Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine, and of the specific mission they had given her to save France from English domination. Most remarkably, she convinced Durand that she could identify the true Dauphin even though she had never seen him, that her divine guides would reveal him to her even if he tried to disguise himself among his courtiers. The journey from Buray-le-Petit to Vaucouleurs was only a few miles, but for Joan it represented a crossing from one world to another. Behind her lay the familiar rhythms of village life, the safety of family and community, the predictable cycle of seasons and feast days that had shaped her first 16 years. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the possibility of mockery or worse from those who would judge her claims to divine revelation. Vaucouleurs itself was a fortress town, its walls built to withstand the raids and sieges that had become commonplace during the Long War. The garrison commanded by Robert de Baudricourt served as one of the few remaining strongholds of French resistance in the region, a lonely outpost of loyalty to the Dauphin in territory increasingly dominated by English and Burgundian forces. Baudricourt himself was a hardened professional soldier, a man who had survived decades of warfare through careful judgment and healthy skepticism about extraordinary claims. When Joan and her uncle appeared at the gates of Vaucouleurs in January 1429, they encountered a world utterly different from the peaceful villages of their birth. The fortress buzzed with military activity as soldiers prepared for campaigns, scouts brought reports from enemy territory, and messengers carried communications between scattered French forces. The very air seemed charged with tension and urgency, as everyone understood that the fate of France hung in the balance of the coming months. Baudricourt's initial reaction to Joan's request was precisely what anyone familiar with medieval society would have expected. A teenage peasant girl claiming to have received divine instructions to save France struck him as either delusional or dangerous, possibly both. He dismissed her curtly, suggesting to Durand that he should take his niece home and give her a sound beating to drive such nonsense from her head. The interview lasted only minutes, and Joan found herself back on the streets of Vaucouleurs with her mission apparently ended before it had truly begun. But Joan's voices had prepared her for this rejection. Saint Michael had told her that Baudricourt would refuse her initially, but would eventually provide the escort she needed to reach the Dauphin's court. Armed with this divine assurance, Joan refused to accept defeat. Instead of returning to Domrémy, she remained in Vaucouleurs, staying with various sympathetic townsfolk who were moved by her evident sincerity and her detailed knowledge of military and political developments that seemed impossible for a peasant girl to possess. During the weeks that followed, Joan's presence in Vaucouleurs began to create a stir among both the garrison and the civilian population. She spoke with remarkable authority about military strategy and political developments, demonstrating knowledge that impressed even experienced soldiers. More importantly, she began making specific predictions about future events, prophecies that her voices had revealed to her concerning the progress of the war. The most dramatic of these predictions concerned a military disaster that Joan said would befall French forces near Orléans on February 12, 1429. She provided specific details about this coming defeat to various people in Vaucouleurs, speaking with such certainty that some began to take notice of the strange peasant girl who claimed to hear celestial voices. When news arrived several days later that French forces had indeed suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of the Herrings on exactly the date Joan had predicted, her reputation began to transform from that of a delusional peasant to something approaching a prophet. The Battle of the Herrings, so named because the English supply convoy that sparked the fighting had been carrying Lenten provisions including barrels of fish, represented another in the series of humiliating French defeats that had characterized the war. Sir John Fastolf's English forces had routed a much larger French army, killing or capturing hundreds of soldiers and destroying valuable supplies desperately needed for the defense of Orléans. The defeat sent shockwaves through French resistance, as it demonstrated once again the apparent impossibility of standing against English military superiority. But for Joan, this tragedy served as validation of her divine calling. Her accurate prediction of the defeat proved to skeptics that her voices provided genuine supernatural insight into future events. Word of the strange girl who had prophesied the disaster began to spread beyond Vaucouleurs, reaching the ears of nobles and clergymen who found themselves reconsidering their assumptions about divine intervention in human affairs. Among those who began to take Joan seriously was Jean de Metz, a young nobleman serving in Baudricourt's garrison. Metz was drawn to Joan not only by her apparent prophetic abilities, but by her evident sincerity and the compelling nature of her vision for France's salvation. In conversations with Joan, he found himself increasingly convinced that she represented something unprecedented in his experience, a genuine conduit for divine will in a world that had seemingly been abandoned by God. Bertrand de Poulengy, another member of the garrison, also fell under Joan's influence during these crucial weeks in Vaucouleurs. These young knights represented the kind of supporters Joan would need to accomplish her mission, men of good family and military training who could serve as both protectors and witnesses to her divine calling. Their growing belief in Joan's authenticity provided crucial social validation that helped overcome the resistance of more skeptical observers. As February turned to March 1429, the pressure on Orléans intensified, and news from the siege became increasingly desperate. The English ring around the city tightened daily, cutting off supplies and reinforcements while their siege engines battered the walls. French morale throughout the region plummeted as it became clear that the fall of Orléans was only a matter of time, and with it the collapse of all organized resistance to English conquest. It was in this atmosphere of mounting crisis that Joan finally succeeded in her campaign to win over Robert de Baudricourt. The exact nature of their final interview remains shrouded in historical mystery, but contemporary accounts suggest that Joan provided Baudricourt with information that convinced him of her supernatural knowledge. Some sources suggest she revealed details about a military defeat that had occurred the same day as their meeting but which news could not yet have reached Vaucouleurs through normal channels. Others claim she demonstrated knowledge of conversations that had taken place in the Dauphin's court hundreds of miles away. Whatever the specific evidence that convinced him, Baudricourt finally agreed to provide Joan with the escort she needed to reach Chinon, where the Dauphin held court. This decision represented an enormous leap of faith for a practical military commander, as he was essentially betting his career and possibly his life on the claims of a teenage peasant girl. Yet the desperate state of French resistance may have made even impossible options seem worth attempting. The preparations for Joan's journey to Chinon revealed the extent to which her supporters had come to believe in her mission. Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy volunteered to accompany her, along with several other members of the garrison. The citizens of Vaucouleurs contributed money to purchase appropriate clothing for Joan's presentation at court, including a man's outfit that would allow her to travel safely through territory where a young woman would face constant danger. The decision to dress Joan in male clothing was both practical and symbolic. Medieval roads were perilous for any traveler, but young women faced particular risks from bandits, soldiers, and other predators who might view them as easy targets. By adopting masculine dress, Joan not only increased her physical safety, but also began the transformation that would allow her to move in the masculine world of warfare and politics. More significantly, Joan's adoption of male clothing represented a dramatic break with the social conventions that governed medieval women's lives. In a society where clothing served as a crucial marker of social identity, Joan's transformation announced that she no longer accepted the limitations typically imposed on her sex. This sartorial revolution would later become one of the charges brought against her during her trial, as her enemies sought to portray her rejection of feminine dress as evidence of heretical rebellion against divine order. The journey from Vaucouleurs to Chinon covered approximately 150 miles through territory that was contested, dangerous, and largely controlled by enemies of the French crown. The party would have to travel largely at night, avoiding main roads and major towns where English or Burgundian forces might detect and capture them. Rivers had to be crossed at carefully chosen fords, and the constant threat of bandits or enemy patrols made every mile a potential site of ambush or betrayal. Joan's companions marveled at her behavior during this perilous journey. Rather than showing the fear that would have been natural for a young person venturing far from home for the first time, she displayed remarkable composure and confidence. She insisted on hearing Mass whenever possible, often requiring dangerous detours to reach churches where friendly priests could perform the sacrament. Her devotion seemed to increase rather than decrease as the dangers mounted, as if proximity to her goal strengthened her connection to the divine voices that guided her. The physical challenges of the journey were matched by its psychological demands. Joan was traveling toward a confrontation with the highest levels of French society, where she would have to convince sophisticated courtiers and experienced politicians that a peasant girl possessed divine authority to determine royal policy. The magnitude of this challenge would have daunted anyone, yet Joan seemed to draw strength from the difficulty of her task, as if she understood that God would not have given her an easy mission. After 11 days of dangerous travel, Joan's party finally approached Chinon, the fortress town on the Vienne River where the Dauphin Charles held court. The massive castle that loomed over the town had been a seat of royal power for centuries, its walls witness to the great dramas of French history. For Joan, it represented the next stage in a journey that had already transformed her from peasant to prophet and would soon transform her from prophet to warrior. She carried no title, no armor, only certainty. The gates of Chinon would soon open to admit the strangest visitor in the castle's long history. A teenage girl who claimed to speak with saints was about to meet the uncrowned king of France and convince him to entrust her with the salvation of his kingdom. The impossible was about to become inevitable, as divine will prepared to collide with earthly power in ways that would reshape the course of European history. Part 3. The Dauphin's Test, March 1429. The court at Chinon buzzed with rumors and speculation, as word spread that a peasant girl claiming divine revelation had arrived seeking audience with the Dauphin. This was not the first time that visionaries and prophets had appeared at the gates of French royal residences during these desperate years of war. But there was something different about this particular claimant that captured the imagination of both nobles and servants within the castle walls. Charles, the uncrowned Dauphin, found himself in one of the most precarious positions ever occupied by a claimant to the French throne. At 26 years old, he had been fighting for his inheritance for over a decade, yet controlled only a fraction of the territory that rightfully belonged to him. The English held Paris and most of northern France, while their Burgundian allies controlled much of the east. Meanwhile, Charles's own legitimacy remained questionable, as rumors persisted that he was not actually the son of the mad King Charles VI, but rather the product of his mother's adultery. The psychological burden of these circumstances had left Charles a man of weak will and wavering confidence, more inclined to seek refuge in pleasures of the court than to pursue the aggressive military campaigns necessary to reclaim his kingdom. His advisors were divided between those who counseled caution and those who urged bold action, but the recent series of military defeats had strengthened the voices calling for prudent withdrawal rather than risky offensives. Into this atmosphere of defeatism and despair came Joan of Arc, bearing a message that seemed too good to be true. She claimed that God had sent her to drive the English from French soil and to see Charles properly crowned in Reims Cathedral, the traditional site of royal coronations. More remarkably, she insisted that her divine voices had revealed to her the location of an ancient sword hidden in the church of Saint Catherine de Fierbois, a weapon that would serve as a symbol of her divine mission. The Dauphin's advisors were deeply skeptical about granting audience to this unusual petitioner. Court protocol typically required extensive negotiations and formal introductions before anyone could approach the person of the king, and the idea of admitting a peasant girl who might be delusional or even dangerous struck many as highly inappropriate. Yet the desperate nature of French circumstances made even unlikely sources of hope worth considering. Charles himself was reportedly intrigued by reports of Joan's prophetic abilities and her detailed knowledge of military affairs that seemed impossible for someone of her background to possess. The prediction of the defeat at the Battle of the Herrings had already reached the court and generated considerable discussion about whether this girl might indeed possess supernatural insight. After several days of debate among his counselors, Charles finally agreed to receive Joan in formal audience. The Great Hall of Chinon Castle on the evening of March 9, 1429, presented a scene of medieval pageantry designed to overwhelm and intimidate visitors. Hundreds of courtiers dressed in their finest garments filled the vast space, their conversations creating a buzz of voices that echoed off stone walls decorated with tapestries depicting the glorious history of French royal power. Massive fireplaces blazed with logs that cast dancing shadows across the assembly, while countless candles provided flickering light that made the entire scene appear otherworldly. Joan entered this magnificent chamber wearing the simple male clothing that had become her standard attire, her short-cropped hair and modest demeanor marking her as completely out of place among the elaborate costumes and sophisticated mannerisms of the nobility. Yet contemporary accounts describe her as showing no sign of intimidation or nervousness as she made her way through the crowd toward the throne where she expected to find the Dauphin. The test that Charles had devised for Joan represented one of the most famous scenes in medieval history. Rather than taking his usual place on the throne, The dauphin had disguised himself among the courtiers while another nobleman sat in the royal seat wearing royal robes and a crown. This deception was designed to determine whether Joan truly possessed the supernatural knowledge she claimed, as she had assured her supporters that her voices would enable her to identify the true king, even if he attempted to hide among his followers. Joan's behavior during this crucial test demonstrated the remarkable composure and confidence that had characterized her journey from peasant village to royal court. Rather than approaching the figure on the throne, she moved directly through the crowd toward Charles, who was attempting to blend in among his courtiers. When she reached him, she knelt and declared in a voice that carried throughout the great hall, "Most noble Lord Dauphin, I am Joan the Maid, and the King of Heaven sends me to you with the message that you will be anointed and crowned in the city of Reims, and you will be lieutenant of the King of Heaven, who is King of France." The impact of this moment on the assembled courtiers was immediate and profound. The murmur of conversation died away as hundreds of witnesses realized they were observing something unprecedented in their experience. A peasant girl had somehow identified the dauphin despite his disguise, and she was speaking to him with an authority that seemed to transcend all social conventions. Whether one believed in divine revelation or not, it was impossible to deny that something extraordinary was occurring in the Great Hall of Chinon. Charles himself was deeply affected by Joan's recognition of him and by the confidence with which she spoke of his future coronation. According to later accounts, he took Joan aside for a private conversation during which she revealed to him information that convinced him of her supernatural knowledge. The exact content of this conversation remains one of history's great mysteries, but it clearly involved matters so personal and secret that only divine revelation could have made them known to a peasant girl from Lorraine. Some historians suggest that Joan revealed to Charles the content of a private prayer he had made to God, asking for a sign of divine support for his claim to the throne. Others believe she provided information about his disputed parentage that proved her access to supernatural knowledge. Whatever the specific revelation, it was sufficiently convincing to transform Charles from skeptic to believer and to set in motion the events that would change the course of the 100 Years' War. The dauphin's acceptance of Joan's divine mission did not immediately result in her being granted military command. Medieval courts were complex institutions where decisions of such magnitude required careful consultation with advisors, examination by theologians, and consideration of political implications that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Charles ordered that Joan be examined by a commission of learned clerics and scholars who would determine whether her claims were genuine or whether she might be a heretic, a sorceress, or an agent of enemy powers. This theological examination took place in the city of Poitiers, where the dauphin had assembled some of the most respected religious authorities still loyal to his cause. The commission included bishops, doctors of theology, and experts in canon law who subjected Joan to intensive questioning about her beliefs, her experiences with supernatural voices, and her understanding of Christian doctrine. The stakes of this examination were enormous, as a finding of heresy or witchcraft would not only discredit Joan but could potentially damage Charles's own reputation by association. Joan's performance during the Poitiers examination demonstrated the remarkable theological sophistication that seemed impossible for someone of her background to possess. She answered complex questions about religious doctrine with precision and insight, demonstrating familiarity with subtle points of theology that typically required years of formal education. When challenged about the legitimacy of her divine calling, she responded with arguments that impressed even skeptical scholars. The examination also revealed Joan's remarkable combination of humility and authority that would characterize her throughout her brief career. She consistently acknowledged her own unworthiness to receive divine revelation while simultaneously insisting on the absolute truth of her mission. When asked to provide a miraculous sign to prove her divine calling, she replied that God had already provided the sign by bringing her safely through enemy territory to the dauphin's court, and that the ultimate sign would be the liberation of Orléans. After several weeks of intensive examination, the commission at Poitiers concluded that Joan showed no signs of heresy or diabolic influence, and that her mission appeared to be genuinely divine in origin. This theological approval provided Charles with the religious authority he needed to support Joan's extraordinary claims, while also protecting him from charges that he was associating with heretics or sorceresses. The political implications of supporting Joan's mission were carefully considered by Charles's advisors, who recognized both the potential benefits and the serious risks involved. On one hand, Joan's presence had already begun to energize French resistance and to provide hope for supernatural intervention on behalf of the French cause. Her reputation was spreading throughout the territories still loyal to Charles, creating enthusiasm for renewed military efforts against the English. On the other hand, failure of Joan's mission would represent a devastating blow to French morale and would provide enemy propagandists with powerful ammunition against Charles's legitimacy. If a girl claiming divine revelation could not deliver the victory she promised, it would suggest that God had indeed abandoned France to its enemies. The stakes could hardly have been higher for a dauphin whose position was already precarious. Charles's ultimate decision to support Joan's mission reflected both his desperate circumstances and his personal conviction that she represented genuine divine intervention. The theological examination had provided religious justification for her claims, while her demonstrated knowledge of secret information had convinced him personally of her supernatural abilities. Most importantly, the military situation had become so critical that even unlikely sources of hope seemed worth pursuing. The preparations for Joan's military campaign revealed the extent to which the French court had committed itself to her extraordinary mission. She was provided with a complete suit of armor crafted by the finest armorers in France, designed to protect her in battle while proclaiming her status as a divinely appointed warrior. The armor was painted white, the color of purity, and decorated with religious symbols that emphasized her role as God's instrument in the struggle against English occupation. More symbolically significant was the sword that Joan requested for her mission. Rather than accepting one of the many fine weapons available in the royal armory, she insisted that her divine voices had revealed the location of a specific sword hidden in the church of Saint Catherine de Fierbois. This weapon, she claimed, had been placed there by God for her use and would serve as a tangible sign of her divine mission. The search for this prophesied sword created another dramatic demonstration of Joan's supernatural knowledge. When messengers were sent to the church she had specified, they found exactly what she had described. An ancient sword buried behind the altar, its blade inscribed with 5 crosses and showing no signs of rust despite its apparent age. The discovery of this weapon exactly where Joan had predicted sent shockwaves through French society and provided powerful evidence for her divine calling. The banner that Joan carried into battle became another crucial element of her symbolic identity as God's warrior. The banner was made of white silk and depicted Christ in judgment flanked by angels, with the words, Jesus Maria, embroidered in gold thread. This image emphasized Joan's role as an instrument of divine justice while invoking the protection of both Christ and the Virgin Mary, to whom Joan maintained particular devotion throughout her career. As news of Joan's mission spread throughout France, it began to generate a popular enthusiasm that had been absent from French resistance for years. Common people saw in her story a vindication of their own faith and a promise that God had not abandoned France in its hour of greatest need. Nobles who had grown weary of endless defeats began to consider the possibility that divine intervention might indeed turn the tide of war. The English and their Burgundian allies initially dismissed Joan as a harmless curiosity, a deluded peasant girl whose claims would be quickly exposed by the realities of warfare. English commanders had grown accustomed to French desperation producing various forms of wishful thinking, and they saw no reason to take seriously the latest manifestation of enemy delusions. This dismissive attitude would prove to be a serious miscalculation as events unfolded. By April 1429, Joan had assembled around her a group of devoted followers who had become convinced of her divine mission through personal observation of her character and capabilities. These supporters included not only the knights who had escorted her from Vaucouleurs, but also experienced military commanders who recognized in her a quality of leadership that transcended her humble origins and lack of formal military training. The most significant of these military supporters was Jean d'Orléans, the bastard of Orléans, an experienced commander who had been organizing the defense of his city against English siege. The bastard was initially skeptical about reports of a peasant girl claiming divine revelation, but his desperation to save Orléans made him willing to consider even unlikely sources of assistance. When he met Joan personally, he found himself impressed by her detailed knowledge of military affairs and her evident sincerity. Joan's final preparations for her first military campaign were completed in an atmosphere of growing excitement and anticipation throughout Charles's territories. She had successfully navigated the complex world of medieval court politics, passed rigorous theological examination, and assembled the military support necessary for her mission. The impossible journey from peasant village to royal court was complete, and the even more impossible task of driving the English from French soil was about to begin. As April 1429 drew to a close, Joan departed from Chinon at the head of a relief force bound for Orléans. She rode a white horse, wore gleaming armor, and carried a banner proclaiming divine authority for her mission. Behind her marched soldiers who had been inspired by her presence to believe once again in the possibility of French victory. Ahead lay the English siege lines that had surrounded Orléans for months, and beyond that the liberation of France that her voices had promised. She walked behind him, but it was her light they followed. The stage was set for the first great test of Joan's divine mission, a test that would either validate her extraordinary claims or expose them as the delusions of a tragically misguided girl. The siege of Orléans was about to become the turning point of the 100 Years' War, and Joan of Arc was about to become the most famous woman in medieval Europe. Part 4. The Miracle of Orléans, April-May 1429. The city of Orléans in the spring of 1429 stood as the last great fortress between English conquest and total French defeat. Perched on the north bank of the Loire River, its massive walls and strategic position had made it the key to controlling central France for generations. But now, after 6 months of relentless English siege, the city had become a symbol of French desperation, its defenders growing weaker with each passing day as supplies dwindled and hope faded like smoke from the cooking fires that burned less frequently in its increasingly empty streets. The English siege lines stretched around Orléans like the coils of a great serpent, their wooden fortifications and earthworks creating an almost impenetrable barrier that prevented French relief forces from reaching the starving city. English engineers had constructed a series of fortified positions called boulevards at strategic points around the perimeter, each one a small fortress in its own right, bristling with cannons and crossbowmen who could rain death upon anyone foolish enough to approach the walls. The most formidable of these English strongholds was Les Tourelles, a massive fortification that controlled the southern approach to the city across the Loire Bridge. This fortress had been constructed on the ruins of an old French defensive work, its thick walls rising like a stone mountain from the riverbank, its towers crowned with English banners that fluttered mockingly in the spring breeze. From Les Tourelles, English cannons could strike any part of the city, their iron balls crashing through roofs and walls with devastating effect both physical and psychological. Inside Orléans, the population had endured months of gradual starvation and constant terror. The city's granaries, once filled with enough food to feed the inhabitants for years, had been systematically emptied as the siege dragged on through the harsh winter months. Bread had become a luxury available only to the wealthy, while common citizens survived on thin soup made from whatever scraps could be found. Children grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, their laughter silenced by hunger, while their parents struggled to maintain hope in the face of seemingly inevitable defeat. The military situation was equally dire. The city's garrison, once numbering several thousand experienced soldiers, had been reduced by casualties, disease, and desertion to fewer than 1,000 effective fighting men. These remaining defenders were exhausted from months of constant vigilance, their equipment worn and their morale shattered by the endless bombardment that had become the rhythm of their daily existence. Many had begun to whisper that surrender might be preferable to slow death by starvation. Yet the symbolic importance of Orléans extended far beyond its strategic value. This was the city where French kings had often held court, where Joan of Arc's own patron saint, Saint Aignan, had once performed miracles, and where the very idea of French independence seemed to have made its last stand. If Orléans fell, as every military expert expected it would, the psychological impact would be even more devastating than the strategic consequences. English victory here would prove that God had truly abandoned France to its enemies. Into this atmosphere of despair and approaching defeat came news that seemed too fantastic to believe. A peasant girl claiming divine revelation had convinced the dauphin to entrust her with a relief army, and she was marching toward Orléans with promises of miraculous deliverance. The initial reaction of most defenders was skepticism bordering on cynicism. They had seen too many false hopes crushed by English military superiority to place much faith in tales of supernatural intervention. But as more detailed reports reached the city, describing Joan's successful identification of the disguised dauphin and her theological examination at Poitiers, Some began to wonder whether this extraordinary young woman might indeed represent the divine intervention that France so desperately needed. The discovery of the sword at St. Catherine de Fierbois, exactly where Joan had predicted it would be found, provided particularly compelling evidence for her supernatural knowledge. The English commanders surrounding Orléans received their own reports about Joan's mission with reactions that ranged from amusement to contempt. Sir William Glassdale, the veteran commander of Les Tourelles, reportedly laughed when told that a peasant girl was coming to break the siege, suggesting that the French had finally descended into complete madness. The Earl of Suffolk, overall English commander, viewed Joan as at best a propaganda trick and at worst a dangerous whose influence would need to be countered through superior force and rational military planning. This English confidence was not without foundation. Their forces had dominated every major engagement of the war for over a decade. Their longbowmen and artillery had proven superior to traditional French cavalry tactics, and their siege techniques had successfully reduced dozens of French strongholds. The idea that a teenage girl with no military training could succeed where experienced French commanders had failed struck them as the last desperate fantasy of a defeated enemy. Joan's relief force departed from Blois in late April 1429, following the south bank of the Loire toward Orléans. The army she led was modest in size, perhaps 4,000 men, but it represented something unprecedented in the recent history of French warfare. Soldiers who believed they were marching to certain victory under divine protection. Word of Joan's mission had spread throughout the territories still loyal to Charles, and volunteers had flocked to join her banner from villages and towns across central France. These volunteers included not only professional soldiers seeking redemption from previous defeats, but also common people who saw in Joan's story a validation of their own faith and suffering. Farmers abandoned their plows, craftsmen left their workshops, and young men who had never held weapons before took up arms in service of what they believed was God's own army. The religious enthusiasm that surrounded Joan's mission transformed this modest force into something approaching a crusade. The composition of Joan's army reflected the broad social appeal of her divine calling. Alongside experienced knights and men-at-arms marched peasants armed with farm tools converted to weapons, merchants who had contributed their own funds to support the expedition, and clergy who served as both chaplains and warriors in defense of what they saw as a holy cause. This mixture of social classes united under Joan's banner represented a revolutionary development in medieval warfare, where armies were typically organized according to strict feudal hierarchies. Joan herself rode at the head of this extraordinary force, her white armor gleaming in the spring sunlight, her banner bearing the image of Christ in judgment flowing behind her as she progressed along roads that had witnessed the passage of armies for centuries. Contemporary accounts describe her as radiating confidence and spiritual authority that inspired even skeptical observers to believe that something miraculous was indeed occurring. The logistics of Joan's march to Orléans demonstrated the practical challenges that accompanied her spiritual mission. The army required tons of food, weapons, and equipment to be transported across difficult terrain while avoiding English patrols that might intercept the relief force before it could reach its destination. Wagons loaded with supplies stretched for miles behind the main body of troops, their wheels churning through mud created by spring rains that turned medieval roads into quagmires. But perhaps more importantly, Joan's army carried with it something that could not be weighed or measured: hope. For the first time in years, French forces were advancing with confidence rather than desperation, their banners flying proudly rather than being carefully hidden from enemy observation. The psychological transformation that Joan's presence had wrought was visible in everything from the soldiers' bearing to their willingness to sing as they marched. The approach to Orléans required careful tactical planning, as the English siege lines made direct access to the city impossible. Joan's military advisors, led by the experienced bastard of Orléans, had developed a plan to approach from the south, using boats to ferry supplies across the Loire while the main force attempted to break through English fortifications at their weakest point. This strategy offered the best chance of reaching the city while minimizing casualties, but it also meant that Joan's first military action would be a complex combined operation requiring precise coordination between land and water forces. As Joan's army approached the Loire Valley on April 28, 1429, the English commanders finally began to take the threat seriously. Reports from their scouts described not just another French relief attempt but a force that moved with unusual confidence, and seemed to be inspiring civilian populations along its route to unprecedented displays of support for the French cause. More troubling were accounts of Joan herself, descriptions that painted her as a figure of almost supernatural authority, whose mere presence seemed to transform ordinary soldiers into zealous warriors. The first direct confrontation between Joan and English forces occurred not on a battlefield but through an exchange of letters that revealed the profound ideological gulf between the opposing sides. Joan had dictated a letter to the English commanders demanding their immediate withdrawal from French territory, claiming divine authority for her mission and threatening divine punishment for those who resisted God's will. The letter's tone was unprecedented in medieval diplomacy, combining religious authority with military demands in ways that conventional warfare had never witnessed. The English response to Joan's letter revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of what they were facing. They dismissed her claims as the ravings of a deluded peasant girl while threatening to burn her as a witch if she fell into their hands. This conventional military thinking failed to grasp the revolutionary nature of Joan's mission and the psychological impact her presence was having on both French morale and English confidence. The actual arrival of Joan's relief force at Orléans on April 29, 1429, created scenes of wild celebration within the besieged city. Citizens who had resigned themselves to defeat poured into the streets, their faces transformed by joy and wonder as they witnessed what they believed was the fulfillment of divine promises. Church bells that had been silent for months rang out across the city, their bronze voices proclaiming that deliverance had finally arrived. Joan's entry into Orléans was carefully orchestrated to maximize its psychological impact both on the defenders and on English observers watching from their siege lines. She rode through the gates wearing her gleaming white armor, her banner held high, surrounded by knights and clergy who proclaimed her divine mission to crowds of cheering citizens. Torches illuminated the procession as it wound through narrow medieval streets, creating a scene that seemed to blur the boundaries between earthly reality and heavenly intervention. The immediate effect of Joan's presence within Orléans was to transform the city's atmosphere from despair to euphoric hope. Soldiers who had been contemplating surrender began sharpening their weapons and planning offensive actions. Citizens who had hoarded their remaining food began sharing it freely, confident that divine providence would provide for their needs. The very air seemed charged with possibility as people who had given up hope rediscovered their faith in French victory. But Joan's impact extended beyond mere morale building to practical military planning that would determine the siege's outcome. She immediately convened meetings with the city's military commanders, demonstrating knowledge of English fortifications and tactical weaknesses that astonished experienced soldiers. Her strategic insights, which she attributed to guidance from her celestial voices, provided the basis for a coordinated assault on English positions that offered genuine hope of breaking the siege. The first major action of Joan's campaign came on May 4, 1429, with an assault on the English fortification known as Les Augustines, a stronghold that controlled access to the main English fortress of Les Tourelles. This attack was planned as a limited operation designed to test English defenses and gauge the effectiveness of French forces operating under Joan's inspiration. What occurred instead was a complete transformation of French military capabilities that stunned observers on both sides. Joan's presence on the battlefield created effects that transcended conventional military analysis. French soldiers who had previously shown little enthusiasm for offensive action charged English positions with fanatical determination, their battle cries invoking both their newfound saint and their ancient hatred of foreign occupation. The psychological impact on English defenders was equally dramatic, as they found themselves facing enemies who seemed immune to the fear that had characterized French resistance for years. The assault on Les Augustines succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, with French forces overrunning English defensive positions that had been considered impregnable. English soldiers, accustomed to easy victories over demoralized French forces, found themselves retreating in confusion before enemies who seemed transformed by supernatural inspiration. The rapid fall of this key English stronghold sent shockwaves through the entire siege apparatus and began to undermine English confidence in their ability to maintain their positions. But the most dramatic moment of the entire siege came on May 7, 1429, with the French assault on Les Tourelles itself, the massive fortress that had come to symbolize English dominance over Orléans. This attack was Joan's most ambitious military undertaking, a direct assault on the strongest English position that would either vindicate her divine mission or expose it as tragic delusion. The stakes could not have been higher for Joan personally or for the French cause generally. Joan's approach to the assault on Les Tourelles demonstrated the remarkable combination of religious faith and practical military planning that characterized her entire career. She spent the morning of the attack in prayer and confession, preparing her soul for what she recognized might be her final earthly battle. But she also worked closely with experienced military commanders to coordinate the complex logistics of a combined land and water assault on a heavily fortified position. The attack began at dawn with French artillery bombardment designed to breach the fortress walls and suppress English defensive fire. Joan positioned herself in the front ranks of the assault force, her white banner visible to soldiers throughout the attacking army as a symbol of divine support for their cause. Contemporary accounts describe her as showing no fear despite the arrows and crossbow bolts that filled the air around her, her confidence inspiring similar courage in soldiers who had previously shown little stomach for such dangerous work. The assault on Les Tourelles became one of the most dramatic military actions of the medieval period, with French forces scaling walls under heavy fire, while Joan urged them forward with promises of divine protection. English defenders, commanded by the experienced Sir William Glasdale, fought with the desperate courage of men who understood that their entire strategic position depended on holding this crucial fortress. The battle raged for hours, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. The turning point came when Joan was struck by an English crossbow bolt that penetrated her armor between the neck and shoulder, wounding her seriously enough to force her temporary withdrawal from the battle. The sight of their inspired leader falling wounded created a moment of crisis for French forces, as soldiers who had believed in her divine protection began to question whether God had truly abandoned them to English military superiority. But Joan's response to her wounding became one of the defining moments of her entire career. Rather than accepting medical treatment and withdrawing from the battle, she pulled the arrow from her own flesh, briefly prayed for divine assistance, and immediately returned to the assault with even greater determination than before. Her reappearance on the battlefield, bleeding but undaunted, created an explosion of French enthusiasm that proved irresistible to English resistance. The final assault on Les Tourelles succeeded through a combination of tactical innovation and sheer determination that reflected Joan's transformative impact on French military capabilities. French forces attacked simultaneously from multiple directions, using boats to approach from the river while scaling parties assaulted the landward walls. The coordination required for such a complex operation demonstrated the remarkable improvement in French military organization that had occurred under Joan's leadership. Sir William Glasdale's death during the final moments of the battle symbolized the collapse of English confidence that Joan's presence had created. This experienced commander, who had mockingly dismissed Joan as a harmless peasant girl, fell into the Loire River when the bridge he was defending collapsed under French assault. His drowning marked not just the fall of a key English position but the beginning of a psychological transformation that would affect every subsequent English military operation. The fall of Les Tourelles on May 7, 1429, effectively ended the English siege of Orléans after more than 6 months of investment. English forces, demoralized by the loss of their strongest position and shaken by Joan's apparent invulnerability to conventional weapons, began withdrawing from their remaining fortifications around the city. By May 8, the siege that had once seemed certain to result in French defeat had been completely broken, and Orléans was free. The immediate aftermath of Joan's victory at Orléans created celebrations throughout French-controlled territory that had not been seen since the early years of the war. Church bells rang in every city and village still loyal to Charles, while Te Deum services gave thanks for what everyone recognized as a miraculous deliverance. More importantly, news of the victory began attracting new volunteers to the French cause, as men who had previously remained neutral decided that God had indeed chosen sides in the conflict. The psychological impact of Orléans extended far beyond French borders to influence opinion throughout medieval Europe. News of a peasant girl's military victory over experienced English commanders created sensation in royal courts from Scotland to Italy, where political observers struggled to understand how such an impossible event could have occurred. Some attributed Joan's success to divine intervention, others to witchcraft, but none could deny that she had achieved something unprecedented in the military history of the period. For Joan personally, The victory at Orléans represented validation of everything her voices had promised since childhood. She had fulfilled the first part of her divine mission by breaking English power at their strongest point, demonstrating that French resistance could indeed prevail against seemingly overwhelming odds. But her voices had also promised that she would see Charles crowned at Reims, a goal that would require additional victories and even greater risks. The English response to their defeat at Orléans revealed the profound impact that Joan's success had on their own strategic planning and morale. Commanders who had previously operated with absolute confidence in English military superiority now found themselves questioning whether conventional tactics could prevail against an enemy who seemed to possess supernatural advantages. The pragmatic military calculations that had guided English strategy for decades suddenly seemed inadequate when confronted with divine intervention. More practically, the loss of Orléans forced English commanders to reconsider their entire strategic approach to the war. The siege had consumed enormous resources and represented months of investment that had now been lost. Worse, the dramatic nature of their defeat had provided French propaganda with powerful ammunition that was already being used to inspire resistance throughout occupied territories. The transformation of French military capabilities that Joan's presence had created became evident in the weeks following Orléans as her army prepared for additional campaigns. Soldiers who had previously shown little enthusiasm for offensive operations now volunteered eagerly for dangerous missions, confident that divine protection would see them through any challenge. Military commanders who had grown accustomed to defeat began planning aggressive strategies that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Joan's own development as a military leader during the Orléans campaign demonstrated remarkable adaptability for someone with no formal training in warfare. She had learned to coordinate complex assault operations, to inspire soldiers under extreme pressure, and to make tactical decisions that combined practical military wisdom with strategic vision. Her natural leadership abilities, enhanced by the authority that came from her divine calling, had transformed her from inspirational figure to genuinely effective military commander. The role of Joan's celestial voices in her military success remained a source of wonder and speculation for contemporary observers. Joan consistently attributed her tactical insights to divine guidance, claiming that Saint Michael and her other heavenly advisors provided specific instructions about everything from the timing of attacks to the positioning of artillery. Whether one accepted these claims literally or interpreted them as expressions of remarkable intuitive military genius, the results spoke for themselves. The broader implications of Joan's victory at Orléans extended to fundamental questions about the nature of medieval warfare and the relationship between divine will and human conflict. For centuries, military success had been attributed to superior equipment, training, and tactics, with divine favor considered a helpful but secondary factor. Joan's triumph suggested that spiritual inspiration could overcome material disadvantages in ways that challenged conventional military wisdom. The social impact of Joan's success was equally revolutionary, as her triumph demonstrated that divine calling could transcend the rigid class boundaries that defined medieval society. A peasant girl had achieved what experienced nobles and professional soldiers had failed to accomplish, suggesting that God's favor was not necessarily connected to earthly rank or social position. This message had profound implications for the relationship between rulers and subjects throughout medieval Europe. As news of Orléans spread throughout France, it began attracting support from unexpected quarters. Nobles who had remained neutral or even supported English claims began reconsidering their positions, while common people who had accepted foreign occupation as inevitable started organizing resistance activities. Joan's victory had demonstrated that English power was not invincible, and this revelation transformed the political landscape throughout the region. The logistical implications of Joan's success were equally significant for the continuing war effort. The relief of Orléans reopened crucial supply lines that connected French-controlled territories, while the psychological boost provided by victory enabled more effective recruitment and fundraising for additional military campaigns. Resources that had previously been hoarded out of fear of inevitable defeat now became available for offensive operations. English chroniclers struggled to explain their forces' defeat at Orléans in terms that would not undermine confidence in English military capabilities. Some attributed the loss to tactical errors or insufficient preparation, while others suggested that Joan's success resulted from diabolic assistance rather than divine intervention. These explanations reflected the difficulty that conventional military thinking had in comprehending the revolutionary changes that Joan's presence had created. The religious interpretation of Joan's victory became a crucial element in the broader ideological struggle between English and French claims to legitimacy. French propagandists proclaimed that God had clearly chosen sides in the conflict by granting miraculous victory to their cause, while English supporters argued that apparent divine intervention must actually represent diabolic deception designed to lead Christians astray from true faith. Joan's personal response to her triumph at Orléans demonstrated the remarkable humility that characterized her throughout her career. Rather than claiming personal credit for the victory, she consistently attributed all success to divine intervention while expressing gratitude for being chosen as God's instrument. This combination of extraordinary achievement with genuine modesty enhanced her reputation and made her an even more effective symbol of French resistance. The immediate strategic consequences of lifting the siege of Orléans created opportunities for French military operations that had been impossible during the months when English forces controlled the Loire Valley. Communication between French-held territories was restored, enabling better coordination of resistance activities, while the psychological impact of victory encouraged more aggressive planning for future campaigns. Joan's success had fundamentally altered the strategic balance in central France. As May 1429 drew to a close, Joan found herself transformed from unknown peasant girl to the most famous person in France. Her victory at Orléans had validated her claims to divine mission while demonstrating military capabilities that seemed impossible for someone of her background. But her voices had promised even greater achievements, including the coronation of Charles at Reims, goals that would require additional victories against English forces who now understood that they faced an unprecedented challenge. The miracle of Orléans was complete, but Joan's mission was only beginning. The road to Reims lay ahead, defended by English armies who would no longer underestimate the peasant girl who claimed to speak with saints. The impossible had become inevitable, but the price of continued success remained to be determined by battles yet to be fought and sacrifices yet to be made. They feared her sword, but feared her silence more.